The idea of a structured approach to risk decision making is perhaps the keystone of the whole of this positive risk taking course. The transformation promised in the overall course title is to provide something that guides and prompts confident risk decisions, an approach that is light years away from the traditional tick box risk assessment formats, beloved of so many regulators, auditors, managers, and anyone else not directly doing the job. Having said that, I'll start with what I feel are useful suggestions from the Health and Safety Executive. They recognise that there are difficulties, there are complexities in risk decision making, but going back to 2001, they advocated very strongly that we need to manage these complexities by having carefully identified processes in the way. Here are a number of the things they identified that were needed in terms of good regulation. And I mention these now because my following practical solution needs to ensure that it at least meets all of these types of tests. You'll see from this list that the first item is about targeted action. That is, we should focus on the most serious risks or focus where the hazards need greatest control. So there's something there about prioritizing within this targeting of action. Then there should be consistency. We should adopt a similar approach in similar circumstances to achieve similar ends. You need to be very consistent in our regulation, very consistent in our approach to very similar types of decisions. The only cause why I pause at that point is, again, I have some concerns that the consistency is what drives the tick box approach in the end. Proportionality, which is about requiring action that is commensurate to the level of risk that we're naturally working with, not cracking a nut with a sledgehammer, which would be a relevant cliche in that situation. Then there's transparency, being open about how decisions were arrived at, showing your workings, as it would be said if you were thinking about maths back in school, but also showing very clearly your consideration of the implications of decisions, being transparent about how you thought about the consequences. And last but not least, accountability, being confident and clear for all to see about who's accountable, including when things go wrong. I will come back in a following presentation to say that does not necessarily mean that we should just support the idea of a blame culture, far from it. But clear accountability within supportive structures is very important. Following on from the Health and Safety Executive example, I would like to go on to remind you of the importance of risk formulation, as discussed in Module 2, Working with Risk. This is an idea, or the concept of formulation, very much emerges from the work of many psychologists. They use formulation as a process to engage and test out their hypotheses, and I'm adapting the phrase into risk formulation to apply this way of thinking very specifically to risk decision making. Good practitioners will focus attention specifically on the bridge between what they've assessed and how this informs the subsequent plan, which is what will make it a very personalised process. And this bridge between assessment and plan, depending on the range of the degree of complexity of the risks involved, this bridge may be referred to in a number of different phrases. It could be summarising the situation. It could be critical analysis of the information. It can be about clinical reasoning, or ultimately it can be about formulation. So what is this notion of formulation, particularly for applying it to risk? I would suggest to you it's about developing those why questions that will help us to disentangle complex information about a person's experiences, a person's risks. Psychologists will say it's then about developing a hypothesis from the assessment and testing that hypothesis. But it is also about being open to changing your initial ways of thinking as new information comes to light. That you're nimble and flexible enough to see these different connections when this information emerges. You test hypotheses out as to what you think might happen, while being open to see that those hypotheses may not be rooted in reality ultimately. And so formulation or risk formulation is very much about identifying thoughts and intent, thinking about signs of things going wrong, the risk factors, the emotions that contribute to, let's say, elevating a risk in very specific situations. And it's about balancing these with the protective factors that I also talked about in Module 2, working with risk. Balancing risk factors and protective factors, remembering that those protective factors are what diminishes or mitigates against the risk. Risk formulation is to be seen as a longitudinal process. It's about looking at a person's history and influences, what's happened in their past, that we might also be seeing in the here and now, in the present, that could then possibly influence future behaviour. And ultimately, we're looking at interpreting or identifying, to start with, interpreting for the individual what their particular cycles or patterns of thoughts and feelings and behaviours are all about. As a person practicing formulation, that may also be in a group or in a team, it's about letting go of preconceived fears or ideas about a person and developing an understanding of what it is that could elevate or diminish the risk in a person's life. Looking at their psychological, their social, their medical background, balancing all of these different factors and influences, it becomes very much a shared communication, which goes back to Module 3, working with people. This kind of flexibility in working methods is vitally important. Then the last point on this particular slide is about a risk decision-making checklist, which I'm offering you as a PDF document resource in this module. This is the culmination, in a way, of all the information throughout the modules of this course. This particular risk decision-making checklist is something that emerges from my own experience, my own decision-making. That's myself individually and in groups and teams of people. It's what I've observed when I've been doing training and practice development, focusing in on people and how they make particular decisions. And equally importantly, it's emerged out of a number of years of detailed semi-structured interviews with people from a whole range of different professions and backgrounds, specifically focusing in on trying to get them to identify how they go about making difficult decisions. This checklist is then brought together from all that massive information. This checklist will act as a guide and a prompt, and you're required to follow it sequentially in order to help you draw in a structured way the relevant information that will help you to arrive at a decision. One of the points on that list will also identify how to succinctly and clearly capture and document what the decision is, particularly with an emphasis on weighing up. This is going back to the definition of positive risk taking. It's about weighing up the pros and cons of different alternatives. A good decision must also state what the alternative was. A good decision is about the reasons for what you decide. It's also about the reasons why you didn't take the alternative choice or choices. So this checklist is there as perhaps the most important resource across the whole of the positive risk-taking course. Before you look at the checklist, well, I'll outline it across a few slides in a moment, but just to continue some of the things, some of the thoughts, some of the ideas, here's an image that represents a challenging decision. I'm not quite sure what the goldfish is thinking in making that leap, but it certainly wants to become a fish in a bigger pond. What calculations would you need to make about the small bowl, about the larger bowl, before you actually decide on that course of action? So, as I've said, the checklist exists as a PDF document, as a resource in this module. I'll just use a couple of slides just to outline the points. Again, the sequence is very important. Starting off by checking in, know who is involved and is leading the decision-making process. Is the client leading it? Is it their choice that we're engaging with? Or is it professionals working on the person's behalf that's identifying the course of action that ultimately requires a decision to be made? Make a context-specific risk assessment. So going back to module 2, working with risk, it's about the narrative. It's not about ticking boxes. Point 3, clearly differentiate the risk-taking that is proposed. That's different. Risk-taking is different from the risk assessment. So there's a differentiation there. Specify the outcomes. Going back to the definition of positive risk-taking. Why are we going to take this course of action? Why are we going to consider taking this risk? What will be gained? Then looking at module 4, working with strengths, that point's highlighted there. Number 5 on this list, identify the strengths, seeing them as the resources, the strengths of the people involved, the strengths of the systems and the processes involved. Point 6 will be anticipate what could go wrong. We can't guess all possible eventualities, but we need to have demonstrated that we've given some consideration that whatever this course of action, it could go wrong. We've given some thought to that, and there are some contingencies in place as to how we would manage it if it goes wrong in ways that we anticipate. Research any historical equivalent attempts at doing the same decision. Has it been tried before? How many times? What happened? If it didn't work, do we know why? Can we do it slightly different? Weigh up the alternative options. Back to that definition of positive risk taking. And out of all of these considerations up to this point, the plan will begin to emerge, developing what that plan is, with who's responsible for taking particular actions, enacting that plan. And then make sure you've documented the clearly reasoned risk decision. And I emphasize the sources of information available at the time that you are making that decision. This is a very important one. We talked previously about hindsight bias. That's the one that helps you there, but document the information that you had available to you. This is what a clearly reasoned risk decision is made of. 4 elements. I've already mentioned them in the previous slide. Clearly state the option that you prefer. Provide the reasons why it's the best option. Outline what the alternatives were that you fully considered. And just state briefly why they were not the best option. That is weighing up the pros and the cons. That is stating a reasoned, defensible decision. That is not a defensive decision. Those are distinct differences in those 2 words. So there's a slide that represents that particular picture of how we do capture what is at the heart of all of this course: clearly reasoned risk decisions. And that goes back to a favourite quote of mine, which I've used a few times during the course. If you don't risk anything, you may risk everything. We need to keep that in mind when we're working our way through particular decisions that are challenging us. And here's another one, another image. Some of our most challenging decisions are going to take us to the edge, so to speak. This image certainly represents the dangers we might have to be managing going to the edge. But it also works as an image to remind us of the great degree of caution we might need to develop when considering some decisions. I can tell you now, no amount of potential positive outcomes are going to persuade me to get in a barrel and go over the top of Niagara Falls. And that's an opportune time, in a way, with this image to remind you a message that I first stated back in Module 1, Developing a Risk Mindset. If you followed the sequence of questions on that attached checklist, and the evidence clearly goes against taking the risk, then don't take the risk. A risk-averse decision is just as good a decision if it is backed by a clearly reasoned process. And so, as I draw this particular presentation towards a close, use the checklist. Identify a current challenging decision for you, for your team, what you're facing presently. Apply the questions on that checklist in the sequence that they are listed, and develop your information in relation by answering each of those questions. And take that through to the point of making your own clearly reasoned risk decision.